The Thrani Ascendancy had been watching the wreck for 9 days when Grand Admiral Sareth Kale decided it was time to be amused. Not literally. Sareth's species did not produce laughter as smaller bipedals understood it, but the deep, resonant flexing of his thoracic plates served the same function, and every officer stationed across the command deck of the Throne of Currents heard the sound clearly enough to understand. Their supreme commander had rendered his verdict on the object drifting in the amber light of a dying star. "It is dead," Sareth said. "Catalog it and move on." The wreck hung at the edge of the Kesrin Shoals, pinned against the gravitational shear of a brown dwarf whose ember glow gave the surrounding debris field a dull, furnace-like hue. 700 meters of angular hull, listing at 11 degrees along its longitudinal axis, turning in the tidal drag with the slow, purposeless rotation of something that had stopped caring where it faced. No engine emissions, no electromagnetic output, no thermal signature beyond what the brown dwarf's radiation painted onto its skin. By every metric the Ascendancy's instruments could apply, the vessel was a corpse. Sensor Adept Tyvara, youngest officer on the deck, had been the one to find it. Her long-range passive sweep had caught a metallic mass anomaly in the brown dwarf's radiation shadow, something too regular for an asteroid, too dense for natural debris, too large to dismiss. She had flagged it per standard procedure, and the Throne of Currents had altered course by 3 degrees to investigate. The Thrani catalogued everything. It was what they did. It was what they had been doing for 41 centuries, and it was why the Ascendancy controlled 314 star systems and maintained the most comprehensive contact archive in known galactic history. Now the entire command staff stood at the main projection array, examining the wreck that Tyvara's diligence had uncovered. The hull geometry was unusual. No curves, no flowing design language. All flat planes meeting at aggressive angles that scattered sensor returns in directions that made accurate measurement difficult. The alloy composition resisted the Ascendancy's spectral analyzers. It took 3 recalibrations before the system could approximate a metallurgical profile, and even then the confidence rating sat below 70%. The hull surface told its own story. Heavy scoring along both flanks, energy weapon burns layered over kinetic impact craters layered over older energy weapon burns, the damage signatures spanning what the decay analysis estimated as several decades. Sections of hull plating were missing entirely, exposing structural skeleton beneath like ribs through torn hide. Other sections had been patched with material that did not match the surrounding surface. Field repairs, hasty, functional, made with whatever had been available. The vessel had no running lights, no transponder signal, and no markings in any script the Ascendancy's linguistic database recognized. It was, by every measurable standard, abandoned. Cross-reference the hull profile against all known vessel registries, Sareth ordered. He settled into his command throne, an ancient seat of carved volcanic stone and living coral that had served the flagship's commanders for 1,100 years. The coral had grown around the stone over the centuries, fusing with it, becoming something neither wholly mineral nor wholly alive, like the Ascendancy itself. Tyvara's hands moved with practiced speed across her console. No match, Grand Admiral. The hull geometry does not correspond to any classification in the Ascendancy's primary archive. The alloy composition is unregistered. The weapon damage profiles suggest engagement with at least 4 distinct weapon types, none of which match known records. Expand the search. Covenant archives, Helistari trade logs, Tesserae pattern libraries. A pause. No match in any allied, neutral, or archived database, Grand Admiral. This vessel does not appear in any record we have access to. Sareth's thoracic plates flexed again, deeper this time, the Thrani expression of thorough satisfaction. An unknown derelict, bearing battle scars from unclassifiable weapons, drifting at the edge of explored space. 40 years ago, when he had been a junior surveyor aboard his first patrol frigate, this would have set his blood singing. Every anomaly had been a potential discovery then. Every unknown was a door waiting to be opened. Now he was 163 years old, commanding the largest expeditionary fleet the Ascendancy had ever assembled. 412 warships, 96 support vessels, 16 mobile shipyards, a combined crew of 460,000 souls. He viewed unknowns through a different lens now. Unknown meant unclassified. Unclassified meant a gap in the archive, and gaps in Ascendancy doctrine were intolerable. The Vithrani had been a spacefaring species for 41 centuries. In that time, they had catalogued 11,472 sentient species, mapped 906,000 star systems, and assembled the most comprehensive intelligence archive in galactic history. Every species was classified, every technology was analyzed, every potential threat was assessed, graded, filed, and revisited on a schedule. The Ascendancy's power rested not on brute military strength, though they had that in abundance, but on knowledge. They knew what existed. They knew what it could do. They knew with actuarial precision how to respond to any of it. An unclassified vessel was an admission of ignorance, and the Vithrani did not tolerate ignorance. "Dispatch a survey team," Sareth said. "Full forensic sweep. Hull samples, interior scans, recoverable data. Standard quarantine protocols." The survey shuttle launched within the hour, carrying 12 specialists, 3 materials analysts, 2 weapons experts, a structural engineer, a linguist, a medical xenobiologist, and 4 armed escorts. Sareth watched their telemetry feed on a secondary display while he attended to the broader work of the expedition. The Kesran Shoals were the Ascendancy's newest frontier zone, 18 star systems awaiting survey and incorporation. The derelict was a minor distraction from the larger task of adding another cluster of systems to the archive. He was certain of this, completely professionally, doctrinally certain. The survey team took 4 hours to breach the outer hull. Not because the material was exceptionally thick, although it was. The issue was behavior. The outer layer cut at expected rates under standard plasma tools, but beneath it lay a composite armor that redistributed thermal energy so efficiently the cutters had to be recalibrated 3 times. The structural engineer, a veteran of 200 salvage operations across 9 species hull types, transmitted a note. "The armor is not merely resistant. It is engineered to frustrate the specific methodology we are employing. The thermal redistribution is not a byproduct of the material's properties. It is the material's purpose. This hull was designed by engineers who anticipated exactly this kind of breach attempt." Sareth noted this with mild professional interest. Unusual metallurgy was not unheard of. Old ships sometimes preserved engineering traditions that had been lost by their builders' descendants. The galaxy was full of curiosities, and curiosities were what the archive was for. The team entered through a ventral hull breach, one of several gaps where armor plating had been torn away by kinetic impacts of considerable force. The interior was dark, cold, and pressurized with a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere at a composition that matched no known species. Gravity plating was offline. The corridors were narrow by Vithrani standards, built for a species substantially smaller than the Ascendancy's average 3-meter frame. Ceiling clearance roughly 2.4 meters. The walls were lined with conduit housings and equipment mounts, many stripped clean, the bare attachment points showing the neat lines of deliberate removal rather than combat damage. The crew had salvaged their own critical equipment before abandoning the ship. A staged, methodical evacuation. Not panic. Not desperation. The orderly departure of professionals who understood what to take and what to leave, who had drilled for this enough times that the procedure was automatic even under duress. The xenobiologist noted something else. The atmospheric composition, though breathable by no known species in the archive, showed trace chemical markers consistent with sustained biological occupation over periods of years. The crew had not merely transited through this vessel. They had lived aboard it. The bulkhead surfaces carried faint biological residue, skin oils and metabolic byproducts absorbed into the wall coatings over time, that told the xenobiologist's instruments a story of long habitation. Years, perhaps decades. This ship had been someone's home long enough that the walls themselves remembered them. The team worked inward section by section, with the thoroughness the ascendancy demanded of its survey personnel. Every compartment documented, every material sampled, every structural anomaly logged. It was the weapons that shifted things. Weapons adept Corin transmitted his preliminary findings from the vessel's forward armament bay in a tone Sareth recognized immediately. The careful, measured cadence of an officer who had found something that violated his assumptions and was struggling to present it without the alarm it warranted. Grand Admiral, the forward weapon mounts are magnetic accelerators, kinetic launchers, rail-type design, 12 units in the forward bay alone. Bore diameter and magnetic flux readings suggest projectile masses in the 40 to 60 kilogram range at velocities between 4 and 7% of light speed. Sareth processed the numbers. A 60 kilogram slug at 7% of light speed carried kinetic energy roughly equivalent to the Ascendancy's heaviest ship-to-ship torpedo, the weapon that required its own dedicated reactor and a crew of 6 to operate. This derelict carried 12 of them in a single bay, powered by magnetic rails that needed nothing but ammunition and electricity. "Continue," Sareth said. The aft sections contained directed energy emitters, coherent beam weapons with crystal focusing, arrays rated for sustained output, approximately 90 seconds of continuous fire before requiring a cooling cycle. The beam focus is extremely tight, Grand Admiral. These are not area suppression systems. They are not designed to saturate a zone. They are precision instruments built to burn through armor at specific, chosen structural points. The targeting servos show tracking tolerances fast enough to follow individual fighter-class targets at combat range. Sareth's secondary arms, the smaller vestigial limbs beneath his primary set that the Vithrani used for fine manipulation, twitched against his thorax, an involuntary stress response. Additionally, Corin went on, the ship carries a layered point defense network, automated short-range kinetic interceptors positioned along the hull in a coverage pattern providing 360-degree protection. The magazines are empty, but the feed mechanisms are intact. The cyclic rate these mechanisms imply is substantially faster than anything in our records. And Grand Admiral, the secondary armament, a battery of medium-yield torpedo launchers mounted along the dorsal ridge, shows magazine capacity for over 400 warheads. The warhead cradles suggest shape-charge designs optimized for armor penetration rather than area effect. A vessel with offensive firepower threatening to capital ships, defensive systems fast enough to intercept incoming ordnance at close range, and torpedo reserves deep enough for sustained independent operations lasting months. 700 meters of purpose-built killing capability, crewed by a species small enough to need 2.4-meter ceilings. "What killed it?" Sareth asked. "That is the question, Grand Admiral. We have found no catastrophic failure, no reactor breach, no structural collapse. No evidence of a single decisive blow. The reactor, a fusion system of unusual design, is physically intact. It was shut down through an orderly power-down sequence. This vessel was not killed in combat. It was abandoned, deliberately, methodically, by a crew that took the time to strip critical equipment and purge navigational databases before they left. Whatever happened here, the crew chose to leave. Abandoned, not destroyed. A warship this heavily armed, bearing decades of accumulated battle scars, had not been sunk by any enemy. It had been shut down and left to drift by a crew that had decided, For reasons the survey team could not determine that they were done with it, or that it was done. Recover any data storage systems, Sarath ordered. Navigational logs, communication archives, crew manifests, everything recoverable. The survey team found the data core 4 hours later. It was sealed inside a secondary armored housing within the vessel's central command space, shielded behind a composite layer that had survived the interior stripping. The linguists spent 2 hours achieving a partial interface with the storage architecture, which used a data format and compression algorithm wholly alien to the Ascendancy systems. Brute force decompression consumed processing cycles that would have run a small warship's tactical computer. What emerged, fragment by fragment, over the course of the next several hours as the linguist and the materials analysts worked in the cold dark of a dead ship's command center, was the operational log of a vessel designated ISV Korova. The designation itself was instructive. ISV. 3 letters that implied a standardized naming convention, a fleet registry, an organizational structure, not a lone ship built by a frontier outpost. A naval vessel, formally designated, part of something larger. The log covered 53 years. Not 53 years of a civilization's history. 53 years of this specific ship's continuous active service. Commissioned, deployed, damaged, repaired in the field with whatever was available, redeployed, damaged again, repaired again, redeployed again. Across 5 decades of operations in regions of space, the Ascendancy's charts did not cover. The ship had fought enemies the log identified only by alphanumeric tactical codes, cold designations stripped of context or sentiment. It had fought alone. It had fought in small formations with vessels bearing similar naming conventions: ISV Belgorod, ISV Estheno, ISV Conjar, ISV Revenant. It had sustained damage the log documented with clinical detachment, hull breaches by location and severity, weapon system failures by unit number, engine degradation by percentage point, crew casualties by count and cause of death. The crew complement, recorded in a partially decoded manifest, was 147. 147 beings, operating a 700-meter warship. A Vithrani vessel of comparable tonnage carried 800 crew minimum. Sarath summoned fleet strategist Voss to his private quarters and placed the preliminary report on the table between them. "Assess this," Sarath said. Voss read without expression. When he finished, he set the report down and was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that came not from having nothing to say, but from having too much to choose from. "The weapon systems are individually inferior to ours in raw output," Voss began. "But the design philosophy is completely alien to our thinking. Our weapons are optimized for fleet-scale engagement, area coverage, overlapping fire arcs, formation warfare. These weapons are optimized for single-ship precision. Every offensive system is designed to allow one hull to fight far above its weight class. The armor redistributes impact energy in ways our cutting tools could not overcome. The weapons are precise, engineered to exploit specific structural weaknesses. The point defense network keeps the ship alive without escort support. The crew complement is skeletal because every system is automated to a degree our engineers describe as aggressive. The automation does not assist the crew, it replaces them." And the navigational logs. 53 years of continuous combat operations. Grand Admiral, no vessel in the Ascendancy's fleet has ever served more than 15 consecutive years in a combat role before returning for full overhaul. This ship was never overhauled. It was repaired in the field repeatedly for over half a century. Either the species that built it lacked the shipyard capacity to rotate hulls out of service, or they deliberately chose to keep their ships operational as long as physically possible. Your conclusion: a species operating from scarcity, limited shipbuilding capacity that compensates by making each hull as durable, as heavily armed, and as independently capable as possible. They cannot build fleets of hundreds, so each ship must be worth dozens. They cannot spare large crews, so they automate everything that can be automated and train the remaining crew to an extremely high standard. And they keep each ship fighting for decades, because replacing it may take longer than repairing it. The crew quarters, Sareth said, 1.7 to 1.9 meters. Small, Voss agreed. Smaller than any combat-relevant species in the archive. Endothermic, high metabolic output for their body mass. Bipedal, bilaterally symmetric, 5-digit manipulators. Small species do not build 700-meter dreadnoughts, Sareth said. The statement carried the weight of 4 millennia of contact experience. The correlation between species body mass and warship tonnage was one of the most reliable constants in the archive. Large species built large ships. Medium species built medium ships. Small species built small ships and compensated with numbers or stealth or alliance networks. It was as close to a natural law as military xenology produced. Small species who are fighting for survival build whatever they have to, Voss replied. His voice carried no argument, only the flat delivery of a strategist presenting a conclusion he wished were wrong. Grand Admiral, I want to note something else. The engagement records show 37 separate combat actions over the Korova's 53-year service life. In those 37 engagements, the log records a total of 409 crew casualties, not deaths. Total casualties, including wounded who returned to duty. 409 casualties across 37 engagements spanning 5 decades of offensive operations. That is a ratio that suggests either extraordinary luck or extraordinary competence, and I do not believe in luck sustained over half a century. Sareth absorbed this. 409 casualties, across 37 engagements, on a ship that had been fighting things larger than itself for 53 years without ever returning to a proper shipyard. The number was not just low. It was an achievement, the kind that implied a species that valued each crew member's survival as a strategic priority, not because they were sentimental, but because each trained operator was as irreplaceable as each hull. Voss continued, the navigational coordinates in the log. I have been attempting to cross-reference them against our charts. Most fall outside map space entirely, but 3 coordinates correspond to systems at the extreme trailing edge of the outer Varathi reach. Sareth's thoracic plates locked, the region we are currently surveying. Yes, whatever species built the Korova was conducting offensive operations in this area of space. The log entries for those coordinates are dated. The most recent is 22 years old. They were here, Grand Admiral, in force, recently enough that our expansion timeline overlaps with their operational history. The words settled into the room the way a cold current settles into warm water. Everything they had touched in the last 9 days now looked different. Sareth made his decision within the hour. Full fleet alert. 412 warships cycled weapon systems from standby to combat readiness. Shield generators across the armada powered from dormant to active. Sensor sweeps expanded from standard survey parameters to full combat detection range. Every passive and active system in the fleet straining at maximum sensitivity. The Throne of Currents, the Ascendancy's oldest and most powerful flagship, 1,800 meters of ancient hull plating, living coral armor and weapon systems refined across 11 centuries of continuous service, brought its main batteries online for the first time since the fleet had departed home waters 4 months ago. The armada tightened its formation. Escorts moved to screening positions. Capital ships oriented their broadside batteries outward. The mobile shipyards withdrew to the fleet's interior. Every procedure was textbook, every maneuver drawn from doctrine that had been tested across 41 centuries of naval warfare. And then the Ascendancy waited. The hours stretched. Officers rotated through watch cycles. Sensor operators stared at displays that showed nothing but the debris field and the brown dwarf's slow, unchanging radiance. The Korova drifted in its amber pool of light, dead and patient. Sareth remained on the command deck, thinking about the species that had built it. 147 crew, 53 years of combat. What kind of species held together in a metal box 700 meters long, through 5 decades of fighting, with no overhaul, no rotation, no relief? The answer, when it arrived, came not as a thought but as a contact on Tyvara's scope. On the 11th day, at 3:47, Tyvara reported the anomaly. Bearing 174, range 260,000 kilometers. Her voice was steady, but her secondary membranes flickered, the V-Thrani equivalent of widened eyes. Not a solid return, intermittent occultation of background stellar sources. Something is passing between us and the stars behind it, Grand Admiral, but it is not reflecting or emitting on any frequency we monitor. A shadow, something large enough to block starlight, but invisible to every active and passive sensor system, the ascendancy deployed. Active scan, Sareth ordered. Grand Admiral, active scanning will broadcast our position across the entire shoals and reveal our sensor capabilities to any monitoring entity within range. Protocol recommends against active emissions in an uncharted frontier zone when the nature of the contact is unknown. I am aware of the protocol. Scan it. The throne of currents lit up the void with a full-spectrum active sensor pulse, a burst of energy that propagated outward at light speed, washing over everything within 260,000 kilometers. The returns populated the display in cascading waves. Tyvara's secondary membrane stopped flickering and went rigid. 712 meters. Angular hull geometry. Dark alloy composition identical to the Korova within the margin of spectral error. No transponder. No running lights. No electromagnetic emissions of any kind, save the faintest thermal bloom from its stern. A heat signature so meticulously suppressed it registered barely above the background radiation of the brown dwarf behind it. The ship was alive, and it was identical to the derelict they had been cutting open for 9 days. It had been there, silent and invisible, for an indeterminate period. Days, certainly. Possibly since before the Ascendancy's fleet had arrived in the system. It had watched Sareth's survey team board the Korova. It had watched 412 warships maneuver through the shoals. It had watched Sareth flex his thoracic plates in amusement at the dead hull, and it had watched his analysts strip the armament bays and decode the navigational logs. It had watched everything, and it had chosen this moment to be found. Contact is accelerating, Tyvara said. 900 gravities, 1100, 1300 gravities and still climbing. 1300 gravities of sustained acceleration. The throne of currents, at 3 times the contact's mass, maxed out at 400. Second contact. Tyvara's voice had tightened, the professional comm compressing into something harder. Bearing 091, range 190,000 kilometers. Same hull profile. Same alloy signature. It was already there, Grand Admiral. It has been there. It is powering up now. Third contact. Bearing 248, range 212,000. Fourth, fifth, sixth. Sareth gripped the arms of his command throne. The ancient coral groaned under his fingers. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Grand Admiral, I count 12 contacts, all matching the Korova hull profile, all maneuvering simultaneously. 12 ships, each 700 meters of angular, scarred, overarmed warship, materializing out of the void as though the debris field itself had grown teeth. They are forming a staggered echelon, Tyvara reported. Each vessel presents its full broadside while keeping forward weapon arrays unmasked. Every ship has independent firing solutions, without obstructing any other vessel's arcs. Fleet strategist Voss appeared at Sareth's shoulder. He had come from the tactical annex without waiting for a summons. That formation, Voss said quietly, requires no centralized coordination, no synchronized maneuvers, no fleet-level command structure. Each ship operates as a sovereign combatant positioned to support the others without depending on them. It is a formation designed for a species that builds every ship to fight alone, and then lines 12 of them up and lets each one do what it does. 12 against 412, Sareth said. 12 ships that accelerate 3 times faster than we do. 12 ships identical to the one whose weapons our analysts assessed as individually threatening to our cruiser class. 12 ships that have been inside our sensor perimeter for at least 9 days without producing a single detection alert. Voss paused. The question is not whether 12 can hurt us, Grand Admiral. The question is whether 12 is the actual number. Open a channel, Sareth ordered. All frequencies, all known linguistic protocols. He spoke with the weight of the ascendancy behind each syllable. This is Grand Admiral Sareth Kale of the Vithrani Ascendancy, commanding the 1st Expeditionary Fleet. You are operating in space the Ascendancy has designated for survey and incorporation. Identify yourselves and state your intentions. Silence. The 12 ships continued their formation, each one moving with fluid, predatory grace. Not the geometric course corrections of automated navigation. Smooth, instinctive arcs. Pilots who felt momentum the way a swimmer felt current. The reply came audio only. A voice smaller than Sareth had expected, spoken in a language the translation system required 11 seconds to process. The text rendered on the main display. This is Captain Marine Hallick, ISV STHNNO, Terran Strategic Navy. The vessel you have boarded is the ISV KOROVA. SHE was lost with all hands 19 years ago during operations in the shoals. Her crew of 147 died defending a colony that no longer exists from an enemy you have never met. We have come to bring her home. Stand clear of our ship. Sareth read the message 3 times. They had come back. 19 years after losing the vessel, they had dispatched a fleet to recover a dead ship and the remains of a crew of 147, not for the technology, which they clearly still possessed in active service, not for intelligence value, since the navigational databases had been purged. They had come back for the hull itself and the dead it carried, for the bones. Strategist, Sareth said, assessment. Voss studied the message with the expression of someone reading a geological survey that had just revealed bedrock where the map showed sand. A species that retrieves its fallen after 19 years is a species with institutional memory of extraordinary depth. Someone maintained the Korova's last known position in a database for 2 decades and dispatched a recovery force the moment conditions allowed. That requires organizational continuity, Grand Admiral. A military culture that treats individual losses as debts to be repaid, regardless of the passage of time or the cost of repayment. Or scarcity, Sareth said, each hull too valuable to abandon. Perhaps, or they do not leave their dead. Both interpretations lead to the same conclusion, Grand Admiral. A species that invests this level of effort into recovering a single lost vessel, regardless of the reason, is a species that assigns profound value to its individual assets. Whether that value is strategic or cultural or something else entirely, the behavioral output is identical. They will come for what is theirs. They will always come for what is theirs, and they will bring enough force to ensure that coming is not a gamble. Sareth considered the message again. The phrasing, stand clear of our ship, not a request, not a negotiation, an instruction delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had considered the alternative and was prepared to implement it if necessary. The voice behind the text was small, physically smaller than any Vithrani, but the words carried mass. A harder possibility was forming in Sareth's mind, one he did not voice yet. 12 ships had entered a system containing 412 enemy warships, announced themselves on an open channel, and asked the enemy to step aside. That was not desperation. That was not ignorance. That was confidence, the quiet, unshakable kind that came from having already calculated the engagement and decided the numbers were acceptable. Grand Admiral, Tyvara reported, the S-Thano is adjusting course toward the Korova, decelerating. It intends to dock with the derelict. Our survey team is still aboard the wreck. Yes, Grand Admiral. Fleet Commander Resick stepped forward, crest high, jaw set. The Armada's second-in-command, 97 years old, a by-the-book officer whose career had been shaped by engagements where the doctrine always worked. Grand Admiral, the numerical advantage is overwhelming, 412 against 12. The strategic calculus is straightforward. We destroy the intruders, secure the derelict, and gain intact specimens of their technology for the archive. There it was, laid out in doctrine-clean language, the textbook response. The response Sarath himself would have given 10 days ago, before the survey team had opened the Korova's armament bays and found weapons that could threaten capital ships, before the navigational logs had shown 53 years of unbroken combat operations, before 12 ships had materialized inside his perimeter after 9 days of undetected observation. The strategic calculus, Sarath said, his voice carrying to every station on the command deck, assumes we know what we are fighting. We do not. We have no classification, no threat model, no engagement history. We have a 53-year combat log demonstrating sustained offensive operations, weapons our analysts describe as individually threatening to our cruiser class, and 12 active warships that sat inside our detection grid for 9 days without triggering a single alert. He looked at Resick directly. We have a species that sent 12 ships into a system containing 412 of ours, broadcasted on an open channel, and asked us to move. That is not the behavior of a species that miscounted. That is the behavior of a species that ran the numbers and liked the answer it got. I want to understand why before I give them the opportunity to show me. Resick's crest lowered. He returned to his station. Withdraw the survey team from the Korova, Sarath ordered. All personnel, immediate extraction, full equipment recovery. A memory surfaced as he watched the withdrawal unfold on the tactical display. Old, buried deep under decades of promotions and victories and the accumulated weight of certainty. Sarath was 26, a junior survey officer aboard the patrol frigate Clarion Watch during the Ascendancy's first census sweep of the outer Perseus transit corridor. Standard expansion work, catalog, classify, file, move on. The humans were entry 714 in the Perseus catalog. Single system species, unremarkable yellow star, pre-expansion phase, a handful of patrol vessels, some orbital infrastructure, nothing above a Category 2 threat rating. The official classification, emergent technological species, current military capability negligible, projected threat horizon 4 to 6 centuries. Sarath had seen one of their ships through the Clarion Watch's optical array. A small craft, barely 200 meters, worn hull, mismatched plating along the port quarter where a repair had been made with scavenged material. It ran a standard patrol route along the outer boundary of the system, aware of the observation frigate's presence but neither approaching nor retreating. Just continuing its route, adjusting course enough to keep the Clarion Watch within sensor range without closing distance. What struck Sarath then, what struck him now across a gap of 137 years, was not the ship itself but how it moved. Every species had a navigational signature. The Vithrani moved with calculated precision, optimized vectors, geometric and predictable. The Helistari moved with caution, wide margins, redundant corrections. The Tessari moved with mathematical perfection, zero deviation, zero waste. The human patrol craft moved like something that lived in the current. Not recklessly, no wasted energy, but the corrections were instinctive rather than computed, the course changes fluid rather than angular, the acceleration curve suggesting a pilot who experienced velocity as a physical sensation rather than a readout number. The ship did not navigate space. It moved through space the way a predator moved through its hunting ground, aware of everything, wasting nothing, always already where it needed to be. Sareth had noted it in his personal log: unusual navigational behavior. The species demonstrates an intuitive relationship with kinetic energy that falls outside standard classification parameters. Recommend expanded observation window. He had not included it in the official survey report. It was an oddity, a footnote, a detail that did not fit any assessment category and therefore, by the archive's logic, did not exist, not worth the paperwork. He had never forgotten it. The way the ship moved had stayed with him, the way a discordant note stays in the ear of a musician who cannot identify the instrument that produced it. Something about it had been wrong, not wrong in the sense of malfunction or error, but wrong in the sense that his models, his training, his 4 decades of studying how species move through space, had no framework for understanding what he had seen. The ship had not moved like a machine carrying organisms. It had moved like an organism that happened to be made of metal, and the Ascendancy's entire classification system had no entry for that. Now, across 137 years, the memory carried a different weight. There had been a second encounter, not with the humans directly, but with the evidence of what they had become. Sareth was 84. A Commodore by then, commanding a border patrol squadron in the Varathi Reach, the same region of space his expeditionary fleet was now surveying for incorporation. Routine work, presence operations, show the flag, catalog new contacts, deter the occasional raider or claim jumper. His squadron had been investigating a debris field in the outer shoals, several transit corridors from where they now sat. The debris was fresh, no more than a few months old. The spectral analysis of the fragments told a story: 2 distinct hull compositions in the wreckage. One was biological, a chitinous composite layered with metallic bone, the kind of structure produced by a species that grew its ships rather than built them. The other was artificial alloy, dark and dense, and bearing the same angular geometry that would, decades later, define the Korova's silhouette. Someone had fought here, recently. The biological debris showed catastrophic structural failure, the kind of damage produced by kinetic impacts at extreme velocity. Not just hits, but hits that had been placed with deliberate precision at structural weak points, load-bearing junctions where a single puncture would propagate into cascading hull failure. The alien vessel, whatever it had not merely been destroyed. It had been disassembled by an attacker who understood exactly where to strike. The artificial debris was different, smaller fragments. Hull plating mostly, torn loose by impacts that had scored the surface but failed to penetrate. A few larger pieces showed the angular geometry and dark alloy that Sareth's analysts could not classify. Whatever ship had produced this debris had taken damage but had not been destroyed. It had fought, sustained hits, lost plating, and then left. The biological ship had stayed in pieces. Sareth's analysts spent 3 days cataloging the debris. They produced a thorough report that concluded with a classification he remembered verbatim: engagement between unknown artificial hull combatant species unknown A and unknown biocomposite combatant species unknown B. Outcome: unknown B destroyed, unknown A damaged but departed under own power. No surviving crew detected. Assessment: localized territorial engagement, no strategic relevance. Recommend logging and continued patrol. He had signed the report and filed it. Another data point in the archive, another gap filled. But the memory stayed. Something about the precision of the damage patterns had nagged at him for decades. Not the violence, that was common enough. The specificity. The biological ship had been large, armored with living chitin that could regenerate damage, and it had been killed by something smaller that knew exactly where to place each shot to make the kill permanent. That was not random frontier violence. That was expertise. Refined, disciplined, practiced expertise, applied by a species that had learned how to kill things larger than itself, and had been doing it long enough to make the methodology instinctive. He had not connected the two encounters, the patrol craft in the Perseus corridor and the debris field in the Varathi Reach, until today. Now the connection was obvious, blinding in its clarity. The small ship that moved like a predator and the debris of a large ship killed with surgical precision were chapters in the same story. A species that had been out here, in this region of space, fighting things, surviving, adapting, refining its methods, for at least as long as the Ascendancy had been ignoring it. Category 2. Negligible, projected threat horizon 4 to 6 centuries. The classification sat in Sarath's memory like a stone in his throat. He could see the entry as clearly as if it were projected on the main display. The confident font, the numerical assessment, the arrogance of certainty applied to a species the Ascendancy had observed for 11 days, 137 years ago, and never looked at again. The archive had stamped a number on them and moved on, because the Ascendancy trusted the archive the way gravity trusts mass, as a law, not a suggestion. They had been wrong. Not slightly wrong, not optimistically wrong, but fundamentally, irredeemably wrong. In the time since that single system survey, the species had built warships that could threaten capital ships, developed stealth technology that defeated the Ascendancy's best sensors, and conducted offensive operations across space. The Ascendancy was only now getting around to surveying. The archive had not merely failed to predict the threat. It had failed to notice the threat was already operating in the Ascendancy's backyard. 137 years later, watching 12 of those ships hold formation inside his armada's perimeter, Sarath understood what his 26-year-old self had observed and failed to recognize. The little patrol craft had not been navigating. It had been hunting. Casually, instinctively, the way a fish moves through water it was born in. And the species that flew that patrol craft had spent the intervening century and a half building 700-meter warships that turned that instinct into something that could threaten a galactic power. The survey shuttle cleared the Korova's hull at 4:11, carrying all personnel and equipment. As it pulled away, the Estheno moved in. 712 meters of angular, battle-scarred warship closing on the Korova, with a precision the Throne of Currents navigation officers watched in absolute silence. The Estheno matched the Korova's drift exactly, corrected for the brown dwarf's tidal forces in real time, and extended docking clamps that locked onto the dead ship's hull with the gentleness of hands cradling something irreplaceable. It was a recovery operation. Clinical, unhurried, clearly rehearsed. This crew had done this before. They had protocols for bringing dead ships home, which meant they had lost ships before, and every time they lost one, they came back for it. Grand Admiral, Tyvara's voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. Additional contacts. A beat of silence on the command deck. Bearing all quadrants, 31 additional contacts, same hull profile. They are emerging from sensor shadow behind the brown dwarf, from the outer asteroid fields, from the deep debris belts along the shoal's gravitational boundary. They were in system already, Grand Admiral. I cannot determine how long. 43 ships, not 12, 43. The original 12 had been the ones that chose to be visible. The other 31 had remained hidden, silent, distributed across the system in positions that exploited every sensor shadow, every radiation pocket, every gap in the Ascendancy's detection grid. They had been there for the entire 11 days, watching, mapping, counting, reading sensor frequencies, studying formation patterns, cataloging every warship in the fleet by class and armament and position. 31 warships inside the perimeter of the most sophisticated sensor grid the Ascendancy had ever deployed, for 11 days, without producing a single alert. Voss had gone still beside Sarath. His secondary arms were locked against his torso, the Vithrani posture of extreme alertness, every muscle taut, every sense focused. 43, Voss said. And we detected 12 only because they decided to let us. The other 31 were inside our grid for the entire period. Our detection is continuous, Grand Admiral, full spectrum, 360-degree coverage, redundant layers, and 31 warships of this classification sat inside it without registering on any system we operate. Sareth said nothing. Through the Ascendancy's long-range optical systems, the command deck could observe the Esthenos docking operations. The faint thermal leakage from the interface between the two ships revealed movement inside the Korova. Small shapes, warm-blooded, working methodically through compartments that had been dark and cold for 19 years. They were recovering the dead. 147 crew members, killed at their stations during a battle fought almost 2 decades ago, being gathered by their own people with the same unhurried precision those people brought to everything they did. Grand Admiral, Tyvara again, the Estheno is transmitting. The message appeared on the main display. Grand Admiral Sorathkael. The ISV Korova served 453 years. Her crew died at their stations during the defense of Leander Colony against an adversary WE designate contact KESSREN-7. Your survey team treated the ship and its dead with professional care during your examination. We observed this throughout. The Terran Strategic Navy acknowledges your restraint and your respect for our fallen. We are not here to fight the Vithrani ascendancy. We are here to bring our people home. When the Korova is secured for tow, we will withdraw from this system. If the Vithrani ascendancy wishes to establish formal contact with the Terran Strategic Navy, broadcast on the frequency we are now transmitting. Someone will answer. A frequency code followed the message. Tyvara logged it without being told. Sareth sat in his ancient throne and felt something he had not felt in 61 years of fleet command. Genuine, unqualified uncertainty. Not tactical uncertainty, the kind that came from incomplete intelligence or poor sensor coverage, those he had managed 1,000 times. This was something deeper. The certainty that he was looking at a situation the doctrine had not been built to handle, because the doctrine's builders had never imagined a species like this. Strategist, Sareth said, one question. If I had fired on the 12 when they first revealed themselves before we detected the other 31, what would have happened? Voss considered it for a long time. The 12 would have engaged at 3 times our maximum thrust, using weapons threatening to our cruiser class and point defense fast enough to intercept our return fire. We would have destroyed some, perhaps most, at significant cost. But the 31 concealed vessels would have engaged simultaneously from undetected positions, targeting our supply ships, mobile shipyards, command vessels, sensor platforms. They would not have tried to destroy the fleet. They would have crippled our logistics and command structure, and then withdrawn. And then more would come. A species that retrieves its dead 19 years later does not write off its living. If we destroyed their 43, they would send 143. And the next force would arrive knowing our sensor frequencies, our formation doctrine, our fleet composition, our command hierarchy, and the position of every asset we tried to hide, because the 43 ships inside our perimeter would have transmitted every byte of that intelligence before the first shot was fired. Sareth closed his inner eyelids. The 12 ships that announced themselves were not the threat, Grand Admiral. They were the greeting. The 31 we could not see were the message. And the message was this: we have been here long enough to know everything about you, and we are choosing to ask instead of act. The Estheno completed its recovery over the next 4 hours. The docking configuration tightened around the Korova, tow cables taking the dead ship's weight with steady, calibrated tension. Through the long-range optics, the command deck watched the Estheno draw the Korova out of the debris field with unhurried, meticulous care. A ship carrying its dead sister home. Log this contact, Soreth told Tyvara. New species classification, priority maximum. Threat assessment, Grand Admiral. He paused. The Ascendancy's threat classifications ran from Category 1, negligible, to Category 10, existential. In 41 centuries, 11,472 classified species, and nothing in the archive had ever been rated above Category 7. Category 7 was the Tesserae convergence, the distributed machine intelligence that had taken the combined fleets of 3 galactic powers to contain. Category 7 was the ceiling, the theoretical maximum. The worst the galaxy had produced. Threat assessment, unclassifiable, Soreth said. Tyvara's fingers hesitated over the console. Grand Admiral, the archive does not have an unclassifiable designation. The system requires a numerical rating between 1 and 10. Then the system is incomplete. Create the designation. Grand Admiral, modifying the classification architecture requires authorization from the Archival Council, which convenes at the Capitol on a rotating schedule and is not currently in session. I can submit a formal modification request through standard administrative channels and expect a response within 40 to 60 standard days, pending review by the Subcommittee on Threat Taxonomy and Nomenclature Standards. It was the most perfectly V-Thrani response imaginable. 43 unknown warships inside the fleet's formation, a dead ship's crew being recovered by a species that had evaded the archive for a century, and the system's instinct was to root the problem through a subcommittee. The archive was not just a tool. It was a cage, and when confronted with something that could not be classified, the instinct was not to adapt, but to wait for bureaucratic permission to acknowledge reality. Soreth looked at her. His inner eyelids were open. His outer eyelids were narrowed. His thoracic plates were locked. Every physical signal his species used to communicate intensity was active simultaneously. Create the designation, Sensor Adept. Tyvara created the designation. The arrogance of 9 days ago sat in Soreth's memory like a wound he had inflicted on himself. The satisfied flexing of his thoracic plates over a dead ship, the casual certainty that it was a curiosity, a specimen for the archive, a gap to be filled and forgotten. He had looked at a warship that had fought for 53 years and dismissed it as a relic. He had studied its weapons, its armor, its navigational logs, and concluded that the species that built it was interesting but irrelevant, because the archive had no entry for them, and therefore, in the Ascendancy's world, they did not matter. And they had been watching him do it, for 11 days, patient, silent. 43 warships arrayed through his formation like predators in tall grass, counting his ships, reading his doctrine, studying his habits, learning his strengths and his blindnesses with the same methodical thoroughness he had applied to their derelict. They had given him time to show them who he was, and then they had shown him who they were. Strategist, Soreth said. Add a personal annotation to the species file. For my successors, every Grand Admiral who sits in this throne after me will read it. Proceed, Grand Admiral. Soreth settled into the seat that had carried 11 centuries of V-Thrani commanders. Outside the viewport, the brown dwarf cast its ember light across a field of debris and ships, 412 of his, 43 of theirs, and the amber glow made everything look ancient, like a painting of a moment that had already become history. The annotation is this: I have commanded the Ascendancy's fleets for 61 years. I have faced the Covenant at Thesrin, the Tesserae at the Cardan Straits, the Gorvinthi raiders across the Varathi Reach, and 17 other combat-capable species across 9 campaigns spanning 4 decades. I have won every engagement. I have never been surprised, never outmaneuvered, never outmatched. The archive has always told me what to expect, and the doctrine has always told me how to respond, and the fleets have always delivered the result the calculus demanded. He paused. The command deck was silent. Every officer was listening. Today, I met a species that placed 43 warships inside my formation for 11 days without my knowledge. That watched me study their dead with the patient attention of an instructor watching a student who does not yet understand the lesson. And that, when they were ready, announced themselves on an open channel and asked me to move aside so they could bring their people home. He looked at the viewport, where the Esthena was pulling the Korova away, the tow cables taut between them, the dead ship's hull catching the dwarf star's amber light. I moved. It was the wisest decision I have made in 61 years of command. Another pause. Classify them however the archive requires. Assign whatever numerical rating the system demands, but understand what the number will fail to capture. They are patient beyond anything I have encountered. They are precise beyond anything our sensors can reliably track. They do not posture, they do not threaten, and they do not bluff. They build each ship as though it is the last they will ever build, and they fight it for 53 years, and when it falls they come back for it 19 years later with 43 more. They crew their warships with 147 people because they cannot spare more, and they arm those warships to fight dreadnoughts because they cannot afford to lose. And that constraint, that scarcity, that refusal to waste a single hull or a single life, has forged them into something the archive does not have a category for. He opened his inner eyelids. Remember this above everything else. The ships you can detect are the ones they have chosen to show you. The ones you cannot detect are already in position. And they have been watching you for longer than you know. Resic approached the command throne for the second time. His crest was lower now, not submissive but recalibrated. The expression of an officer who had watched his assumptions dismantled and was processing the implications. Grand Admiral, for the record, if we had engaged per standard doctrine, if we had treated the 12 contacts as hostile incursions and opened fire on detection, what would the engagement have looked like from their perspective? Sareth regarded his second-in-command for a long moment. It was the right question. The question of an officer who wanted to learn, not one who wanted to justify. From their perspective, Sareth said, it would have looked like a test. And we would have failed it. Resic absorbed this. A test of what? Of whether we were worth talking to. The Esthenos captain did not contact us on arrival. She did not announce her presence when her ships had the advantage of surprise and position. She waited. She waited 9 days, Commander. 9 days during which her concealed ships mapped our formation, identified our command vessels, cataloged our weapons systems, decoded our communication frequencies, and established firing solutions against every strategic asset in the fleet. And then, when she had everything she needed to prosecute a devastating first strike, she chose to transmit a message instead. Because destruction was never the objective. Assessment was the objective. She wanted to see what kind of species she was dealing with, whether we were the kind that fires first and thinks later, or the kind that can recognize when thinking is the better option. She gave us a choice, and she was prepared for either answer. Resic was quiet then, and if we had chosen wrong, then we would have learned the cost of choosing wrong, and the Terran Strategic Navy would have filed us under a different classification, not as a species worth establishing formal contact with, as a species to be managed. The word managed settled across the command deck like a cold draft. Every officer understood what it meant when applied by a species that had sat invisibly inside the Ascendancy's most powerful fleet for 11 days. Sareth turned to Tyvara. One final scan of the derelict's former position, record everything, then secure the sensor grid and resume standard survey operations. The Kesran Shoals are still our frontier. That has not changed. But something else had changed, and everyone on the command deck knew it. The shoals were still the Ascendancy's frontier, but they were no longer empty. They were no longer unclaimed in any way that mattered. Somewhere out here, In the debris fields and radiation shadows and gravitational wells of the outer reach, a species that the archive classified as Category 2 negligible was conducting operations, building warships, fighting battles, and recovering its dead with a tenacity and a patience that the Ascendancy had never encountered in 41 centuries of expansion. The archive would be updated. The classification would be changed. Diplomatic protocols would be drafted through channels that had never been used for a species the Ascendancy could not quantify. And somewhere in the Archival Council, actuaries who had spent their careers calculating threat projections would receive a new species file with a classification they had never seen before, and a Grand Admiral's annotation telling them the variables they relied on were inadequate. None of that was Sareth's immediate concern. His immediate concern was simpler, and it sat in his chest with a weight that surprised him. He had spent 163 years believing that knowledge was power, that the archive was the Ascendancy's ultimate weapon, that classification was control. And he had just met a species that had been operating in his space, building warships beyond his assessment models, and watching him from positions his sensors could not find, for decades. The archive had not failed because it was poorly maintained or understaffed or underfunded. The archive had failed because it was built on the assumption that everything worth knowing could be known, and the universe had just politely demonstrated that the assumption was wrong. Sareth Kale, Grand Admiral of the Vithrani Ascendancy, Supreme Commander of 412 warships and 460,000 crew, had been humbled, not by violence, not by a battle lost or a fleet destroyed, by 43 small ships carrying 147 dead sailors home, and the quiet professionalism of a species that could have destroyed his fleet and chose not to. The arrogance of 10 days ago was not merely embarrassing. It was instructive. It was the arrogance of a species that had mistaken the breadth of its archive for the depth of its understanding, and Sareth was determined that his successors would not make the same mistake. The human vessels withdrew from the Kesrin Shoals over the next 6 hours. They left the way they had arrived, silently, precisely, one ship at a time, each vessel slipping back into the sensor shadows and radiation pockets and debris screens it had occupied for 11 days. The Ascendancy's full-spectrum detection grid, the most sophisticated sensor architecture in galactic history, tracked each departing contact for an average of 11 seconds before losing it entirely. 11 seconds of visibility, then gone, as if the ship had never been there, as if nothing had ever been there. The Esthena went last, pulling the Korova behind it on tow cables that held the dead ship with the steady, careful tension of a pallbearer's grip. The Korova turned slowly on the cables as the Esthena accelerated, and for a moment the dead ship's angular hull caught the brown dwarf's light at the perfect angle, its scarred surfaces warming to amber, the missing armor plates and patched sections and kinetic impact craters all illuminated in the dwarf star's glow like the weathered face of a veteran caught in firelight. 53 years of service, 147 dead, 19 years adrift, and now, finally, the long way home. Then both ships passed beyond the sensor horizon and were gone. By morning, the Kesrin Shoals were empty. The debris field drifted in the brown dwarf's eternal amber glow. 412 Vithrani warships held formation in a silence that felt different from the silence of 11 days ago. 11 days ago, the silence had been the comfortable quiet of an expeditionary fleet at the frontier, confident, expansive, the silence of conquerors surveying new territory. Now the silence carried weight. It was the quiet of a species that had spent 41 centuries believing it understood the universe and had just been shown, politely, carefully, without a single shot fired, that the universe was deeper than the archive. Grand Admiral Sareth Kale remained on the command deck until the last trace of the last human vessel faded from the scope. Then he rose from his throne, placed one hand on the ancient coral where 11 centuries of admirals had rested their weight, and walked to his private quarters. He did not sleep. He sat at his desk and opened the communication frequency the humans had transmitted. He studied it for a long time, the way he had once studied the movement of a small patrol craft through a distant system's outer reaches, with attention and with the growing understanding that what he was looking at was more significant than it appeared. Then he composed a message, not a demand, not a diplomatic protocol citation, not a survey classification request, a greeting, honest, unguarded, stripped of the ascendancy's 41 centuries of imperial formality. One commander speaking to another across the dark, with nothing between them but the frequency and the willingness to use it. He sent it into the void and waited. The dark between stars was vast and patient and indifferent, and the signal was a single thread of coherent light cast into an ocean that had no bottom and no shore. He did not know if the humans would receive it with interest or suspicion or clinical detachment. He did not know anything about them except what 11 days and a 53-year operational log and 2 encounters spanning a century had taught him. They were patient, they were precise, they were dangerous beyond any metric the archive could capture, and they did not leave their dead behind. That was enough to begin with. Everything else would have to be learned. 43 days later, someone answered.